Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 14 of Afrikanists Assemble. We are very excited to be here live at this year's lecture series, and we want to first of all say a huge thank you to all the organizers for inviting us to be part of this. And we are also really grateful to have the opportunity to come together digitally with both audience members and over a dozen of our beloved podcast contributors. I didn't count them, but I see a lot of them, and that's really great. So again, for those who are unfamiliar with the project, maybe some words in front. My name is Veronika, I'm from the University of Leipzig, and I'm the coordinator of the project Recalibrating Afrikanistik. And as already mentioned, this is a partnership of 6 universities, 3 in Europe and 3 on the African continent. And together they seek to shift the study of African languages and literatures over the course of 8 years. And of course, a big part of the project is in-person exchange between the partner universities, but that was unfortunately made impossible to a large extent in the first couple of years of the project because of the pandemic. So in response to that, my colleague Brady at the University of Bayreuth and me, we created the video podcast Afrikanists Assemble as a way to still bring together a whole bunch of different perspectives on our field from people all over the world. And we wanted to do that in a way that minimized the burden on our contributors and also to somehow get around some technological problems in order to present the field in a fresh and accessible way for everybody. And that's why for the podcast, we have invited an ever-growing number of contributors to whom we send one question every month, giving them about 2 weeks to send us a 3-minute audio clip, oftentimes via WhatsApp, for example. And we then splice together these audio clips into an episode as though the contributions are in conversation with one another, and then we post it on YouTube. And the format of a video podcast actually allows us to feature contributor slides. And those slides show who's speaking without us having to interject with moderation in between. But most importantly, it also allows us to feature subtitles and have a very open language policy. So our contributors are invited to speak in whatever languages they want, and we include subtitles in English. But also the platform on YouTube gives us the opportunity to create captions in any language that we want. And as I mentioned, when we were invited, for example, to the Globe 21 festival, we created German captions because the festival mostly took place in German. And now I hand over to Brady.
Yeah, so this moment, however, marks the very first time our contributors have met and spoken to each other live. So how this works is we'll be recording a conversation between our contributors for about 60 minutes. After that time, we will stop the recording and open up the floor for discussion with the audience. If you are in the audience, please keep yourself muted until we turn off the recording. If you are a contributor and you would like to speak, simply click the raise hand button. And then if you're at the front of the queue, just unmute yourself and speak. You don't need to wait for us to call on you. Although we normally have a very open language policy, we don't have the time or infrastructure to do interpreting for this live event, so most of the discussion will take place in English. However, if you have something to say that's best said in another language, go ahead. We have a lot of linguistic resources in this room, but we also don't need to understand everything to learn from each other. And so now with these contributors, we are going to dive into the first question of this live podcast. The first question is, what is your utopian vision for cooperation/research collaborations in African studies? What does it have to entail? What are the aspects that make it decolonial? Assembled Afrikanists, What do you think?
Okay, my utopian vision is happening. And I think partly we will see it here. And we can thank that horrible corona crisis for really being giving a boost to all this meeting in cyberspace. So I think that this gives us a huge opportunity to do a lot of things together. So what I've developed myself for my research from the beginning when I was on my own in a family in a small village in Africa, working on my PhD day in, day out, very a lone wolf, so to speak. And now when I go back next week, I work with people on that same language, speakers there that I'm in contact with regularly, and they send me their videos because they have all those stuff and more. And that's then the utopian vision. They will tell me what is interesting, because I think of course, I try to decolonize myself. I'm a colonial. I try to decolonize myself by thinking about how to study language and culture from within. I am from outside, but with people from within, I think that works very well in my experience to have that perspective, internal perspective. But I mean, whether I want it or not, my questions are formed by how I'm trained and what I read, and by you being here together, by all of this. And I think that the real contribution of diversity into science and into linguistics will be when my colleague Basilisa in the village will tell me what she finds exciting about her language. So that's just for research, but I don't want to go on more, but I think we could say a lot about education as well, that will be completely different in the time to come when we can organize these kind of meetings easily. Let me stop for now.
Yeah, thanks, Maarten, very much, because I feel also that this is already happening in a way. Actually, as you say, thanks to Corona and the boost in digital instruments, so that we can now have people from all over the world being present right now, right here. And I think this is something that Berenike said it before, that we could make use of also in the project Recalibrating Afrikanistik. And it means actually, amongst others, to really include our African colleagues with their questions and their needs. And we had some examples where it was clear that I, for example, had a different idea of what I wanted to do. And then we talked about it. And then in the end, we did something else, which was probably not my prime interest, but which was the interest of my African colleagues. And that is something I would like to add. I mean, I try to decolonize myself. I'm also trained in the West. I come with my European-based disciplinary questions. And that is part of the work I'm doing, critiquing my own disciplinary basis. That is one part of it. But the other part is trying to find the common concerns that we share with African colleagues. That is kind of an ideal, but also asking questions and allowing questions to be asked that I may not be interested in the first place, but getting myself engaged in these questions. That is what I like. I think we become really decolonial if two things happen. If there are African colleagues coming to do research in Germany on German people or on our concerns, for example. And the second one, now I think this is the first one, and then African colleagues, when African colleagues come and really do research with us here. And the second one would be if sociology and history and at least the social sciences, humanities disciplines have understood that they also need to decolonize. And when this is no longer a topic, whether I'm a specialist of Afrikanistik or African studies, but when Africa is just a topic like any other, then I think we are more decolonized.
Well, if I may jump in, my idea of decolonization will be, I'll be careful with it, and because I also come with a kind of positionality, and I want it to always also reflect in that way, and in a way that also emphasize on practices as much as not even just the ideological base itself, but even practices. And what do I also mean? It's also paying attention to self-reflexivity. And in this case, it's not only the European position that needs to reflect also, but even practices on ground, because in the case of Nigeria, I was trained in Nigeria for my bachelor, and I'm still in touch with the context. And I know that we still have challenges with curriculum a lot. It's still burdened with colonial legacy. But in reality, nobody stops us, or maybe in practice, from at least largely making efforts towards rethinking this idea of discipline and how we think of our curriculum, and even how we structure our knowledge to also prioritize solutions that reflect our priority at this time. So this question is more of also demanding accountability from across board and making everybody rethink the colonial project, not just as demanding accountability from a part, but a kind of collective movement in that case, and the one that really takes account to contextual priority and reality.
I think I can relate a lot to what Dapo and Marie Beck have said. When I took my courses in African Studies in Leipzig, I frequently asked myself, why am I actually not doing this in any African state? I'm doing this far away from where things are actually happening, even from the history I was mostly interested in. So I think if we get students to have that mindset, to know that they are currently probably all the time in the wrong place studying this, then I think this is a great way forward. And I would, as a historian, I would like to see, in a very utopian vision, African scholars to come to Germany, to come to Europe, being able to study the history of the discipline and then redesign it the way they want to have it. That would be a great utopian vision for me, which is a bit reflected here in Afrikanists Assemble, but to have them to redesign to their needs or to their focus or to their topics, they want to do that. And I think one of the last points for me is in collaboration or research I have encountered, it would be very nice to have equal principles for Europeans going to Africa and for Africans coming to Europe, and especially language-wise. It is usually expected for African scholars to speak a decent English, French, or German to whatever context they come. But if you apply it the other way around, at least for historians, I would say, if you ask how many people speak a decent level of an African language, their knowledge usually is very poor. So if we apply same principles, that would be great.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm always having the impression like everyone has said what I actually plan to say, but then let me just use my voice to put it this way. I think this is how I look at it. In as much as if I am in Africa, I might think there's no point talking about African studies because I'm in Africa in a way. So if I have to hear about African studies, then it should be in a foreign continent. But my ideology should be that in as much as I enjoy seeing so many Germans, so many people all over the world doing Afrikanistik, I would also love to see many of these Africans being part of it too. In such a way, when I hear about Afrikanistik, I always look forward to seeing many African researchers, but I've always been somehow disappointed when I go for some of these seminars or these conferences, and when I hear about Afrikanistik, I don't get to see these African researchers themselves. I just have the impression that Africans will be able to tell their stories themselves. They will be able to tell it better. So giving them this opportunity to be a part of the Afrikanistik, we say it's going to be better. And talking about decolonization, I like the idea. I also think that maybe somehow unintentionally, we are still colonizing the decolonized idea we are talking about, because this is in a situation where Swahili is being taught in German. I think we have African scholars, African teachers who can teach this Swahili. But then I'm in an Afrikanistik department, and the department itself is written in German, Afrikanistik. I always have to translate to English to write African department or African Institute or something like that. But there are also African languages where we could also use to refer to this department, but then it's been referred to in German. In other way, we use a colonized language or a colonial language to refer to a language that we want to decolonize. So I was just thinking maybe taking some of these things into consideration, where we have more of these Africans maybe teaching their languages, and in an Afrikanistic department, maybe imagining perfect stuffs, but I would have really loved to see more of African languages in an Afrikanistic department. We have so many of these African languages, but so far, maybe because I'm limited, I don't know about others, I only hear about Swahili and Hausa languages, but I guess we have many of these other languages. So in my opinion, if we really want to decolonize, maybe we should take some of those things into consideration and just add into the voices of others who said more of the African scholars, more of the African colleagues should also be incorporated into the project to make it better. Thank you.
Yeah, to add to that, my utopian vision would probably go via funding, because if in African universities, the kind of funding is available that many projects are kind of, even when they are incorporating African universities as partners, much of the funding is coming actually from Western organizations. So in many ways, decolonializing African studies is not really going to happen with decolonizing Africa itself and undoing those historical colonial economic relations that have allowed this very unequal funding basis. So that would be one utopian vision. Two small things kind of coming from the library side of things, of how to act in a decolonial way, in a very practical, small way yourself, would be, for example, everything that one publishes, having it available open access, so that it's not a question of where you're based, how well equipped your university is. You can just get access to anything you're looking for yourself. And another thing that I would find very important, and this is part of our project by acquiring only books published in Africa, is going via citations. Because every now and again you come across publications where in African studies where hardly any African scholars are cited, and that's really problematic. So I suppose citations and open access are two very practical ways of being decolonial while we work towards the utopian funding vision.
Yeah, thank you for those contributions. I tried to make notes and maybe pick up some of them, but let me just start with an idea that I've kind of been having, which is that I think part of a lot of you have been saying like about the integration of African colleagues into African studies, and I agree with that obviously. And then the interesting thing for me is also, as a kind of white German scholar in African studies, what should I be doing in the sense of like a decolonial research practice in Germany as well? And if I kind of, and at the Institute, we always talk about, I think we always, all of us always reiterate this quote by Eliseo Makamo, like studying Africa, understanding the world. So we actually kind of moving away from this idea of, I think Rosemarie said, Africa is a topic like any other, just like Europe or just like any other region, right? So we're trying not to kind of just look there, but also really understand each other through each other. And one thing that I'm kind of seeing in Germany a lot now is like decolonial activism, actually kind of having a much clearer idea of what we should be doing to decolonize than we as scholars in African studies, because we're always trying to walk the line between academia and activism. And for me, like a utopian vision would really be if we could do more research together with activists in new ways and find kind of a common way where we can profit from each other's strengths in that way. Like I'm just thinking about like the renaming of streets or the pulling down of statues kind of worldwide, you know, they're like kind of material practices, but they also have to do with words. And we as Africanists, we deal with language and words as well. And there seems to be, there's also a lot of colonial violence embedded in those words and languages that are being written down then by us, etc. So how can we kind of learn from this coloniality and bring it together with the decolonial practices of activists without kind of getting into this panic of, oh my God, we're going to lose our objectivity? You know, so this is just something I'm grappling with. It's not an answer to anything, but just something I've been thinking about.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to follow the ongoing discussion. Just yesterday, I read this article that was giving an overview of what happened at the African Studies Association conference in Cape Town last month. And there was this question, decolonization, is it just a buzzword? And I think that is a question that we are also trying to answer today. And in trying to answer that, my idea of a utopian vision, especially for cooperation in African studies, would be one in which we have more South-South collaboration, which is important to me because when I look at African studies as it is right now, we have many African universities rushing, and you can even use the word competing, to secure collaboration with universities in especially Europe. And I think we will be at a better place when we have African universities rushing to collaborate with each other, so that I can sit here and be in a project with Makerere University in Uganda or University of Ghana or University of Zimbabwe. That doesn't happen. We have all African institutions rushing to secure collaboration in Europe. And of course, there are reasons why that's happening. The other thing I would like to see is perhaps a moment in which people who we deem as the source of knowledge for African studies also become the beneficiaries. And I don't think we're there yet, because we are in a place in which the people who are the source of knowledge just provide that raw data for us to run away with and discuss in removed spaces, publish in papers and books that these people will not access. And therefore, in many ways, they still do not benefit. And when I think about this, I think about the huge funding dedicated to African studies and African studies projects, and especially projects in Africa. And where the funding comes from always has to be where the benefit goes. So I would like to see some disruption to eventually lead to a balance in how we conceptualize this field, generally speaking. Thank you.
All right. To answer this question, let me draw from the field of translation studies and the place on research on Africa context within it, from that where I come from. So let me give you a very quick background. Since the early 2000s, the Global South has received increasing attention in translation research. In the endeavor, let me quote from two researchers, Kotari and Wakabayashi, in order to push back the largely Eurocentric boundaries of the discipline and to remap the field, end of quote. But still, research on African context has remained small or circumscribed to specific fields, as this is often ineluctably paired with post-colonial theory or orator, which, although significant, overlook the complexities of the post-colonial era we are living by now. And also, translation research that is posited in the background of the world literary space is anchored also to a terminology based on concepts such as minority, periphery, or dominated, so terms that remain controversial. And I'm presently interrogating myself on how we can adapt not only the terminology that we use in translation studies, but also its methods and its methods of analyzing and discussing translation flows in the global literary space to make it more inclusive. And thinking about this, in relation to these questions I've been asking myself, I think that my utopian vision is based, among other things, we could mention many, but it's based on inclusivity. Inclusivity of the language we use to discuss about phenomena, but also to represent them. And not only at a broader and perhaps abstract level as the academic discussion, as I was mentioning before, but also a very practical one, and how things are represented in the place we work, for instance, and how, for instance, African languages and literature are sometimes put into the departments under the label of small. And I think how nice would it be to remove that adjective and including them with the rest of the world languages and literatures. Inclusivity of spaces or geographies, with which I also mean the potential of research on African context to speak directly to other contexts and vice versa. Banal example I was thinking was sometimes research outputs are segmented and speaking to themselves. I think of books where you have books on a topic, a broader topic, and then you have all these discussions segmented per area, per geographies like Africa and Asia. And why should we necessarily compartmentalize knowledge? Or inclusivity of or accessibility of resources, as has been mentioned here. How nice could it be to have more like open access and free resources to really share what we do? Well, in the end, to conclude the speech for the sake of time, but not in the very end, also the inclusivity of approach to research. What I feel, for instance, in the field of translation studies is often research in African context has a lot to do with data extraction, but I think we should also aim at theory building from within and sort of contribute to global discussion. So those are things which I've been reflecting in relation to the field of translation studies, but I think we could also speak to, the broader context of this platform.
I wanted to say that in thinking about this question, I kept getting stuck on the word utopian after a while, because it seemed to me that what I was thinking of were things that should be happening or should be happening anyway. And then I felt like I wasn't sure whether what I was thinking of really counted as utopian. But for me, just being able to participate in a conversation like this is something really special and even utopian. And I wanted to mention that and how grateful I am for the chance to listen to you. I think one thinker who I'd like to visit sometime, although I'm not an expert in his thought, is Walter Mignolo. Especially, I really admire his recent book, The Politics of Decolonial Investigation. And I think one reason I really like Walter Mignolo's work, and you may know him, he was born in Argentina and is based at Duke University, is because he's really clear in his argument that decolonizing means not just sort of changing or reopening or remaking the set of materials that we work with. And so for me as a literary scholar, this is important because we have usually our set of texts, that are the canon, and there's often discussion of rethinking the canon. And what Walter Mignolo reminds us is that it's not just a set of objects of study that needs to be scrutinized and remade, but also ways of knowing. So the methods and epistemologies that we use to approach our objects of study, or even to define what those are, or what it means to be an object of study. And I've been thinking a lot again recently about an experience that I had years ago after my undergraduate degree, which was in African studies. When I was in Tanzania and visiting with poets in many different parts of the country, poets who had written poems that appeared in the newspapers. And often in those discussions, one question that would come up for me was the question of why, if I was a poet in English, which I was, why would I, to study Swahili poetry, why would I not write poems in Swahili and engage with poets in that way? And I think, at the time, I felt like my answer was because it's really, really hard. I really can't do it. But I tried, like prompted by those poets. I was able to try. And I think more than that, I feel like that question that they often ask me is something that I still live with now and reflect on, because I think besides the warmth of that invitation, which was really meaningful to me, like just the warmth of that invitation seemed like part of an artistic practice that was different from my experience in English. I think that those poets were showing me that the way of knowing their work, the real way from their perspective, was a bit different from what I had imagined. And it would be not so much to ask them about it, but to write poetry in response to their poems. And for me, I think maybe that's one example of that sort of importance of reflecting on ways of knowing that Walter Mignolo's work points us to, and that to my mind is probably part of utopian futures.
I think this kind of ties in well with my thoughts. Much of, or many of the ideas have already been mentioned. I'm not going to reiterate all of it, but I think, so to say, one of the probably visions utopia also was a big word for me in thinking about this, is to constantly also question what literature is and why, so to say, we are all in a bubble, in an academic bubble, no matter whether we are in an African university or at a European university, and how do we, in a sense, kind of expand the thinking about what we actually look at. And probably what Maarten said, like, right, let the speakers of the language tell me what is interesting. So let the speakers of the language, the poets, tell me what poetry is in this sense. And really kind of how do we get out of this? I was thinking about it when I was writing down my thoughts this afternoon about how to get away from this extractive knowledge production, the data mining in Africa and the theorizing in the West, but also I see also at lots of African universities, you have the theories, in a sense they come as a set, and then they are kind of often being imposed on the literature. And that's also why we, working on other literatures, we also don't quite fit into comparative literature conferences. So it comes with all kind of sets of problems. And so it's really about, so to say, ways of knowing, discussing with people outside of the academy and really question the very notions we have, right? So what is prosody? What is, so to say, what is a poem? What is literature? I think really to ask these questions anew. And I think in this way, the decolonial, which I think that's what Jacky said before, the big discussion, how does it not become a tokenism? Yeah, how do we really change views? I think that's a big thing. And the other thing I think, which for me, I take translation at a much more literal level than Serena did. So I think if we want to change the colonial library, we just have to translate and bring more texts in. And this can be by putting up libraries and collecting books in Frankfurt as well as in African context. But I think we really just also need more translations. We need translations from the village and from towns and from different centuries and from different thinkers. And then we can also kind of really introduce them into classes, into education, into our discussions. And the third thing that I think hasn't been mentioned, and that's why I just want to add it, what I feel increasingly important, and I definitely haven't done enough about that, is also the outreach. I think, Maarten, you've done much more on your side than I have ever done, is the outreach, so to say, towards the German society where I live, to make them in a way understand what our questions is, what, so to say, that Africa is not a country. It sounds banal, but I'm constantly, I don't know about you, but I'm often confronted with questions that are so banal and shocking, so that I feel that nothing is really ever changing. So last year when Abdulrazak Gonna won the Nobel Prize, I was asked these questions if he is representative of Africa, and all these questions where one really feels like there has been, I mean, nothing actually that has somehow improved in the last decades, and the view is even getting more restricted somehow, although we have post-colonial and decolonial discussions about the Humboldt Forum and so on. So that was really shocking to me, and I felt like, okay, blame on me as well. I think there needs to be, we need to do much more as well.
Thank you, everyone. I want to pick up from where Prof. Clarissa has stopped, and I must confess I'm intrigued by the way from the global north there is interest in African studies, and I can feel like there is the baggage of the colonial trying to decolonize the way you approach African studies from your part. But now my understanding, the way I want to perceive it is from my African perspective, and what comes out is that I'm shocked that, like what Jacky said, the South-South collaboration is almost non-existent. So much so that it requires an external force to make us appreciate that which that's supposed to be generated from within. But now, when it comes from outside, then we are the first people from my context to come out and claim that, no, this is like a continuation of kind of a colonial practice. But I wish that I would see more South-South collaboration. I am in Kenya, but I can tell you almost literally nothing about what is going on, say, in Zambia. But somebody from the West seems to be more informed about what is happening, especially in African studies from outside the African content. So my take is there is more need for us. The collaboration, my utopian view is where we have more South-South collaboration, where we have a kind of a scholarship that does not rely on an external force, that pushes us to want to learn about ourselves, to want to produce more about ourselves. And also a kind of collaboration with the North where there is a repatriation of what was lost earlier, but then when we create new, we get to share on an equal platform.
Actually, I'm also struck by what you were saying, Vincent, that South collaboration, that we need more of that, that's clear. And I think it is also, I appreciate that you are saying we need to do that ourselves. I would speak from my position. I would rather try to say we need to have something like research justice. It's a word I learned today from Lara and from Agnes Young, which sounds very easy, but it's actually very complicated to accomplish, where the knower is not always the one in the North. The scientist is not only the one from the North, but the scientist who is the one who knows, is the one who produces knowledge, who creates his objects of knowledge, and so on. So there would be very deep-seated changes be necessary. That would be kind of my answer to needing more South collaborations, which we can only say, okay, do it, let us try. That would be something. For example, now in recalibrating, we see this as a need and as a concern, which came from the colleagues themselves, and which we then go and try to support, for example, with seed money or something like that, right? But there was also, I want to go back a little bit to what Clarissa was saying and what we've been hearing before about our role as teachers or as professors in the German university, because I think this is also important. I used to say that I'm producing development for German students, not for African people. So that was a bit polemical, but I think that we are still confronted with lots of prejudices or lack of knowledge, lack of understanding, which then is really something we need to, or that's my intention, which I want to bring into the classroom and do that. Another thing which strikes me sometimes is that I, as a scholar of African studies, I am exoticized in a similar way that Africa is exoticized. So me, a white scholar, white professor in Germany, white scholar is enough, you don't need to be a professor for that. But there's so many ascriptions that you encounter when you say I'm doing African studies, and everybody assumes you love Africa or you want to help Africa. People are really astonished if they realize it's not what you want to do. Yeah, and I think this is a balance that I find very difficult to deal with. On the one hand, to teach about Africa, but also teach whom and produce knowledge for whom. I would still say I mostly produce knowledge for German students and for German society. And that is how it is at the moment. And I would like to get out of that fix, in a sense.
All right, thank you very much. Part of the problems that we have in Africa is what I'm experiencing now. You can imagine I have been cornered off the screen because there's no network. Well, looking at the utopian situation, I want to look at it differently from my angle as a Nigerian, because in Nigerian universities, we have few faculties that actually constitutes African studies. And they have been busy carrying out researches in these areas. And I think they've achieved enormous success. We can collaborate with them. The collaboration between the South and the North is very, very important. And one of the key things that we must do is undermining the differential in complex and development levels in academics. Because if you look at what is happening there and what is happening over here, you may find no reason to collaborate with us, especially with how we do what we do. This is very, very important, because if you, I'm sorry to say, I'm a Nigerian. If you give a Nigerian money to do research, except for few of us who decided to do what is expected, we may go and marry more wives or buy a podcast to prove to our community that we have arrived. But that is not what is expected from where that research is being called for. That is why I mentioned that trust is very key when it comes to collaboration and decolonization, especially in African area. Because there are areas within African studies where people are not ready to release information to the researcher, especially if they know that you are not a Nigerian or a member of their family. For instance, in Benin Kingdom, nobody will teach you how to cast bronze, and it's an artistic work. Till today, it is only that family that owns the secret to that work. So divulging or giving information for research in African area is very, very, especially in the area of mysticism, African medicine, is very important. And it is in this area that African language is important, like Clarissa Vierke, sorry if I didn't pronounce the name properly, said. So it is very important because, for instance, he was talking what is poetry called in Africa. In my language, in Nigeria, particularly in Benin, we call it Ekara. Ekara, that is the language for poetry. So we have other aspects in that regard. For instance, you have Ekara for the commoner and Ekara for royalty. So we must also look at attention to details, because the way you understand it in your area is different from the way we see it in our own area. Attention to details in African, African, and European collaboration is very, very important, because we have different cultures, different worldviews, and it will take in-depth attention and serious attention to details. And again, wholesome revelation of findings or what it implies. We could be what? Wholesome revelation of what it is. So these are important areas. Then again, we have to look at the African side of it. We have to see things from the African side of it. The balance between the European and Africans is a sliding scale, and it requires this collaboration to create that balance that is actually required for us to get to what the level you want us to get to. Again, let me thank you for your interest in African studies, and I think this will start a new involvement. In fact, your interest is part of the decolonial of African studies. The interest of Europeans is part of the decolonial of African studies, that now you realize that there's something to benefit from Africa, and there's something for Africans to benefit from Europeans. So I was happy the way Brandy pronounced my name. It shows that he has interest in African studies. I did not assist him. And I'm also happy that Clarissa is asking what is poetry called in Western Africa. I am so glad that you are interested. So I think we need this collaboration so that the gap will be minute, and so that we can move forward easily with Africans. Again, we need to believe and support the emergence and development of these Afrikanist projects. The decolonization is very, very important. The colonization started with Europeans, and the decolonization is about to start with Europeans. So I think we are glad to work with you. And that is part of the project that we need, part of the compensation, sort of, not necessarily compensation now, part of the reward that we are likely to get for working with Europeans. Thank you.
Dr. Oman David had said most of it. I would just like to reiterate, coming from my experience, I'm still working on my PhD. I'm trying something on cyber literature, tech literature. I'm trying to see how we can project the African language to our people, and then how subsequently it will kickstart other collaboration through cyber literatures. For example, I started put together some proverbs in an animation form, locating them in music and then putting them online. But my problem is the response. Usually the response is quite slow, but yes, I get more of views and more views, likes and shares, but comments gets people to get engaged. It's quite slow. It's like people are not really interested in their own language. And coming to think of cyber is a fast way of trying to get to other countries. For example, I put, coming from Nigeria, Middle Belt, to be precise, Plateau. I had to put them together. And I hope maybe some others will start something like this, and then we can decide to pick and see how others are. But the problem mostly is funding for big projects like this, because putting together animation is quite expensive. But when attention is given to cyber literature, so there are some forms of literature. These are literatures that can easily get across to many. My utopian vision is bringing it to a state, rather than we use the technology for our own benefits, rather than looking at these languages as inferior, because most of the animation were in the original languages of the native speakers. So I think cyber literature too should be given attention so that we take it to another level. Thank you.
Thank you. So Maarten said something really important, and I just thought I should add something. When she mentioned that people are not interested in their own language. So I'm really interested in that, because I have this strong impression that is still part of the colonized mentality that is actually making people not to be interested in their own language, which I think maybe one way she could succeed is just by encouraging. I'm saying this because very recently I was having a talk with a friend. She's from Cameroon too, and we obviously discuss in Pidgin, the Cameroonian Pidgin, most of the time. So we're talking about the importance of, I think as many might know, Cameroon has over 280 something languages, considering how small the population is for something like that. So we're talking about the importance of our children getting to learn our different languages, and also getting to learn Pidgin. And I realized she, like many others, do not know the importance of Pidgin, because they still do not consider how important it is. They still think it's still not supposed to be an acceptable language. It's not even supposed to be called a language as such. So, but I discovered that when I told her that, do you know that Nigerian Pidgin is being taught as a foreign language in a university in, I think that's Southern America? She was like, really? That's when her interest, like she becomes, really? Oh, so it's that important. Okay, so Pidgin is important. So, I mean, I just thought I should chip in this, because it seems even us with these languages, we want to hear that foreigners are interested in learning this language before we become interested in our own language, which is still the process of colonization. Just the mindset of, I think I need to be good in speaking English. I think I need to be good in speaking French. But what about Pidgin? What about Swahili? What about Lingala and all of this? So I just thought I should add to what Maarten said. She might want to use some of these tricks to let people know that as you're running away from your language, unfortunately, foreigners are going to learn this language more than you do. So it's important for you to also know your own language too. Thank you.
Yes, I don't think at this level, with regards to language, nobody is colonizing Africa. I think Africa is colonizing itself. Now, the reason is this. I can write poems, I have written poems in my language, Esa, and I can transcribe them. And it is my responsibility to teach my children. But if you ask me as a writer, what is your greatest regret? I will tell you my greatest regret is writing in another man's language. I write in English because that is where it is commercialized. Because if I write in my own language, it is for a little group of people. So villages in Africa now are cosmopolitan. They are bigger cities. Industries have developed. And we have so many languages in Africa. A convergence of these ethnic groups in a company means crisis if they have to speak their language. So they need a common language, which is the English language. And it is only with English language that they can relate. So I think it is time for Africa or Africans or the various countries in Africa to sit down and develop a language for each of the country. I think that is important. So when a slave discovers that he has been a slave and seek emancipation, he has half ceased to be a slave. So if you were colonized and now you discover the importance, you decolonize the process. And that is what they are reminding us. It is fortunate that the people we thought colonized us are the people who are reminding us that there's need for decolonial efforts. And I'm grateful to them. So I don't think we have to struggle to do the decolonial aspects of the gists of today. No, it is not because people are not interested. It is because people want their children to understand English language, the language of passing exam, the language of getting a bigger job, the language they speak in the city, and the language of affluence with disregard to their own language. Thank you.
That's where we had to stop the recording, but that's certainly not where the conversation needs to end. What do you think about the role of language in decoloniality? What is your utopian vision for cooperation in African studies? What do you think of the perspectives our contributors brought to this live podcast event? Leave a comment with your thoughts below. Thanks so much for checking out this special episode of Afrikanists Assemble. We're thrilled to have such engaged contributors and viewers. If you haven't subscribed, please do so, and share this channel with anyone you know who might be interested. See you for the next episode.
I will